The second scenario is the one believed in by Ben Bernanke and Barack Obama. And that's that we're over the worst. This is a transition year. Next year, we'll see a slight recovery, and 2012, we're back in the game. So it's a V rather than a U. And we call that scenario new balls, please. This is a scenario where, the game changes so much in the recovery that you need new balls. In 4 fundamental respects. Number one, the banks are going to be much more heavily regulated, and we all know that with Basel III. Number two, it's not going to be easy to get money anywhere in the world, like it was at the beginning of this century. Credit's going to be difficult. Number three, and the biggest change of all, is that the East is going to be the economic equivalent of the West. And that is huge. Changes the game completely. I mean, just one statistic. General Motors in the last 4 months has sold more cars in China than it has in the United States. I mean, that's an incredible statistic. I mean, one of the professors at the school got up during our session and said, "Let me remind you, Mr. Sunter, we were the largest economy in the world for 1,000 years, from 400 AD to 1400 AD. We've had a brief intermission of 600 years. Now we're back." And then the fourth major change in the game is that we think that technologies will move from information to resources, because the Malthusian world that was predicted by an English economist called Thomas Malthus in 1798, that human population growth would lead to starvation, is beginning to become a reality. You're seeing a serious scarcity of resources developing. Metals, certainly, oil, 90 years of cheap oil left in the world, water, even food. And so therefore technologies which improve our resource consumption are going to be the next driver, as well as obviously substitutes for existing metals and energy and so forth and so on. So solar energy, for example, we think is going to be huge over the next 10 years. In fact, we play a scenario where all of you in this room will have your own private sort of home power system, and Eskom becomes a standby generator. It's you might say, no, that's being fanciful, but think about it. 20 years ago, we were all with landlines. Now we're with cell phones. So it's quite possible that we'll have independent energy systems in our houses in the next 10 to 15 years. At the moment, we only give a 20% probability to that scenario. We feel strongly that the flags, which would indicate we're in that recovery scenario, first, a major reduction in unemployment in America, and secondly, a reduction in national debt worldwide, simply haven't taken place. We give a 40% probability to the U, everywhere in the world. And then we give a 40% probability to a scenario that we call ultraviolet, a UV. It's where some places in the world have a U, others have a V. And our candidates for the U are Europe and Britain. Our candidates for the V are China, India, Africa, and parts of South America. We can't quite work out where Japan and America fits into this particular scenario. But that third scenario, if you reflect on it, has been in existence for the last 10 years. We've had a two-speed world. I mean, if you had invested in the American stock market in January 2000, the Standard & Poor's 500 index was, I think, 1,500. Well, at least it was that in March 2000. Right now, if you watched Bloomberg last night, it's around about 1,170. And so, you'd have lost money in America, around about 20% of your wealth. If you'd invested in the South African stock market in January 2000, it was 9,000. It's now 28,000. So you'd have tripled your money in South Africa. And the rand, a few days ago, touched the value that it was in 2000. So all those financial advisors who told you to take your money offshore were plumb wrong. And in fact, in this scenario, the whole concept of risk around asset management changes completely. You're totally dumb if you invest in Europe in the next 10 years in an ultra-virus scenario. You should be going for the emerging economies or companies with exposure to emerging economies. But what you don't do is bet on the U economies. So it's a very interesting scenario to discuss in terms of the strategic implications for your business. On South Africa, we said in the article that South Africa's been in the Premier League since 1994 when we became a proper democracy. What is the Premier League? It's the top 55 nations in the world that are annually ranked in a survey done by the International Institute for Management Development in Switzerland, and it's called the Global Competitiveness Survey. It's not to be confused with the one that's just come out from the World Economic Forum. And we have been between 35 and 40 in the survey since 1994, which come out in May of every year. But in 2007, we took a huge dive. We went from 37th position to 50th position in 1 year. We fell 13 places. And the following year, 2008, we fell another 3 places. So we were 53 out of 55. The only 2 nations below us were the Ukraine and Venezuela. So as Chantal and I said, we're in the relegation zone. And the reasons for getting into the relegation zone were, number one, violent crime driving talent out of this country. How can you stay in the Premier League if you're losing your talented players? Number two, HIV/AIDS shortening the lifespan of an average South African. 3, our infrastructure was showing signs of disrepair. And 4, some of our industries were looking distinctly uncompetitive compared to Eastern players, such as our textile business. But in 2009, we bounced back. We were 48 out of 57. They added 2 nations to the list. And this year, we're 44. And the reason given was that our banks have basically survived the financial meltdown in relatively good shape. None of our banks had to be bailed out. And our national debt to GDP ratio is 28%. So Trevor Manuel should take a bow. So out of the relegation zone. And Chantal and I basically have 3 current scenarios for South Africa. The first is we stay in the Premier League, and we actually get back into the 30s. In fact, we might get back into the 30s next year because of the way we handled the World Cup this year. We're the only African country at the moment listed in the Premier League. The second is, after a brief reprieve, we slide down into a scenario that Chantal and I call second division. It's where the bulk of the third world lies. Poor but peaceful. Yeah. As businesses, you still make money, because lots of people make money in third world economies. But for the government, it's tough, because they certainly won't get the tax revenue that they got in the Premier League, and they certainly won't have access to international capital that they had in the Premier League, just when Eskom needs another 400 billion rand for its future stations. So, you know, it's a tough scenario. If the flag of violence goes up, we move into a scenario called failed state. It's where you join the likes of Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. It's where people won't touch you with a barge pole because you're too violent, you're too unpredictable.